There definitely seems to be lots of excess deaths continuing into 23. As we can clearly see the excess for the 75 plus people, which is not at all recognized by Euromomo. There seems to be absolutely no, it is quite clearly on the zero level. Hi there! Today I'm returning to the topic of excess deaths, and I will be concentrating in this video to Finland. In the next video I will be looking into other countries as well from the same perspective. And let's just define excess mortality to start with, so we know what we're talking about. Excess mortality is not something you can precisely determine, although sometimes you can see and hear some rather specific and definitive numbers. It refers how much the number of deaths in a certain country or region differs from what is expected based on the data from the previous years for that same time period. But how exactly do you define what is expected based on the previous years? There's basically two major ways of doing this. The first, which is very simple and straightforward, is to take the average from the previous years, for example 5 years, for each week, and then compare the number of deaths this year each week to these average figures from the previous years. While this is a very simple way of getting specific numbers, it only gives a reliable result if the general yearly mortality over these previous years stays pretty much on the same level all the time. However, it is very typical that at least in some age groups the overall evolution of the death numbers is either inclining or declining over the years. In these charts here I have marked the deaths from all causes in 4 age groups, and the data is directly from the Human Mortality Database HMD, which can be downloaded at mortality.org. The faint purple line here shows the weekly fluctuation, and the stronger line over it is slightly smoothing out to give a better idea. The red line shows the baseline, which I have calculated in a certain way, and it's kind of a super smoothed version of the fluctuation, in this case based on the years from 2015 to 2019 and then extrapolating it into the coming years. The way I've done it here is mostly that I'm taking the average of 3 consecutive years, and then, because the idea here is to examine the changes in mortality during the COVID pandemic and afterwards, we produce this red line based on the years up to 2019, but also to the beginning of 2020. So this way you get the red line up to early 2020. If the line is steadily inclining or declining, you should expect the steady inclination or declination to continue in the same manner into the following years. However, if the inclination is changing over the 5 years period, you should equally expect the same kind of change to continue. So for example, in the age group of 75 to 84 here, you can observe that at first it is rising gently, and then it is leveled on the same level, so there's a change in the inclination, so that it turns into a declination. So if you just follow the mathematics, you expect the same to continue, so the declination to slightly increase over the years. Then if we look based on this chart, the actual excess deaths. So here in this previous one you see the overall deaths in the purple line, which is not excess deaths, and then you have the baseline to which you compare to find out the excess deaths. So then this is how the excess deaths curve looks like for this particular age group. So you can see that there's clearly a very high excess in the end of 22, but also in the beginning of 23. And this one is based on the first method, which is comparing to the average of 2015 to 2019. And this again is based on the trend, so it's using the red line. So you can see that there is some difference, but the difference is not very large. Here the scale is a bit different. Here's minus 100 and here's minus 50. That confuses it a bit. But we see that the highest peak here in 22 is slightly under 150, whereas with the first method it's slightly over. But in the 2023 beginning is pretty much on the same level. When we look at the 85 plus age group, we can see here the excess that is based on the 2015 to 2019 average, and then the trend of 2015 to 2019. So the trend, which means the changing baseline. So again, we see that there's not a very big difference using these two methods. Let's make a note that using both methods in both age groups there is a clear excess mortality starting from mid 21, so 85 plus years, and 75 to 84 we have the rise of excess deaths in around mid 21 or a bit earlier. And now let's look at the peak excess deaths of week 15, 23, first in the 85 plus age group. So it is here week 15, and we can see that there is a substantial excess death there, and depending on the system we use, it's around 50 or 60 excess deaths per week there between the weeks, let's say 14 and 24 in that region. However, when we look at the 85 plus group in Euromomo, which is a site that gives you precisely the excess deaths for many European countries, for week 15, 23, and that let's say from 14 to 24, there seems to be absolutely no, it is quite clearly on the zero level, so no excess deaths in the second half of 23 according to Euromomo, which is a bit strange. Apparently then Euromomo has used a different method to define the excess deaths here that what I have used, and we will be coming into that, what might be the explanation for that. And then if we look at the 75 to 84 group, and also around the same area from 14 to 24, we again have clearly some some excess there. It is even greater, is in the 70-80 deaths per week. And what does Euromomo say about 75 to 84 for that time? Yes, there is some excess on week 23 and 24 here, but between 14 and 20 it is again pretty much on zero level, which does not at all match what we are observing here in this data that I have taken from human mortality database and then creating the baseline based on that data. And this idea that there is excess in early 23 on week 15 comes very apparent when we plot out week 15 for each consecutive year. So here you can see this green line, and it rises remarkably in the beginning of 22, but it's very high on in 23 as well. So this seems to me, and doesn't it seem to you, that there clearly is a substantial excess death in the 75 to 84 years old group at that time of 23. You can see that the line goes up and down a bit, but this is we shouldn't draw too drastic conclusions from this, because it is precisely a particular week each year. Instead, we should look at the changes in the annual mortality, which you can see here. This is directly again from the HMD data. And here we can see that as before, it seems that there was an elevated mortality in 2018, and indeed there was, but it was in that early spring or mid-spring 2018, whereas the whole year there was no elevated mortality in this age group. But if we look at the 85 plus group, there indeed was clearly some excess deaths in 2018, and this was both also in the younger age groups. In the spring of 2018 there was excess mortality, mostly because there was this intensive influenza B epidemic that spring, which was affecting most countries in Europe. And what we can observe here is that in this dark red curve, which is 85 plus years old people, that as you have elevated deaths in 2018, the overall deaths that year, the trend goes back down to match the previous trend the next year. So there's a drop next year. And you can see something similar in 22 and 23, that you have a very high elevated mortality in 22. This is the entire year 22. And this is in 23, it is dropping down again to match better the overall inclination of the curve. Here, of course, we must be careful, because this 23 full year mortality is just extrapolated from the first half of this year. But anyway, we have a clear rise in mortality, and then next year you have a lower mortality, kind of lower than expected. It's very logical, because when there is something special going on that causes more deaths, it's mostly the most fragile people, the oldest people, the people with multiple underlying health conditions that die, and then the next year these fragile people are no longer there. There's less fragile people to be affected by whatever causes the deaths. So it is very likely that when you have elevated deaths certain year, a certain age group, that the next year it will be lower. So this is why the excess in 22 is very remarkable, because we can see in 21 that there is a lot of excess deaths, particularly in the 85 plus group. Here we see 21, it's very elevated compared to 2020, and because of this there should actually be a lot less deaths, more to the level of 2020 or even less than that in 22, but instead we have more excess deaths in 22 than 21. So how can this be? Especially when we consider that at this point in 22 and especially the second half of 22, most of the people in the 75 plus groups had received at least 3 COVID vaccinations, so they should have been protected from COVID. And indeed, this is, I don't have the details here, but we know that a majority of the excess deaths in 22 and 23 are not at all related to COVID, but they are something else. Now, the Finnish authorities claim that the high number of excess deaths among the old people is because of large number of people now coming to a high age compared to the previous years. And this apparently does explain a part of the situation, and now we'll look into this. Apparently this factor has been taken into account in the Euromomo charts. And indeed, this situation is true, but it only applies to the 75 to 84 years old group. Now, let's look at another chart. This is downloaded from the Finnish Statistics Center, the official source for national statistic information. And you can see how in the 75 plus group, the amount of people is increasing indeed in 2020, and then onwards that it increases clearly faster than it was increasing from 2010 to 2019. And why is this? It's because as can be seen in this, which is from again from the official statistics website, that in 1945, so right after the war, there was this kind of a really big national baby boom, continuing all the way to about 1960. So there was a lot more people being born over those 15 years than had been the case previously. 2020 happens to be exactly 75 years after 1945, so from 2020 onwards you have more people entering the 75 plus group. So the official Finnish statement is truthful in this sense. But when we look at this development, we can see that there is an increase of people in this age group also clearly prior to 2020. So it's about 2% increase, although there was a decrease in birth before 45, and also that when we look at the excess or the general deaths for the 75-84 age group, there is no addition to the mortality each year up to 2019. Although there is clearly an increase in the population in this group. What this means is that as the population in that group is getting larger, but the deaths are staying on the same level, so proportionally a smaller part of that age group each year is dying. And this might be because of developments in the healthcare system, better nutrition, whatever is the reason for that. There is a kind of less deaths than expected based on the increase in the population in that age group. And then after 2019 there is an average of 5% each year, so 2% and 5%, so there's 3% difference in the increase of the population in that age group. And so we could expect a 3% increase in mortality based on this, not more than 3% from 2020 onwards. And when we make this adjustment, here it is in the 75-84 age group, we get a curve like this. So now it's not, the baseline is no longer going down, it is going up. So here, I repeat, it is that you have a 3% extra each year after 2019. But we still have this significant, it hasn't reduced that much, we still have lots of excess deaths in 23. This is where we are concentrating, because this is where we are in contradiction with Euromomo, which states that in this age group in early 2023 there is no excess mortality. And then we must take something else into account which further increases the excess deaths. Like we noticed before, that when there is higher excess deaths on a certain year, then we anticipate a lower excess deaths the next year. So because the high excess of 21 and 22 was not expected in this chart here, because here from 21 onwards they are predictions. The 21-22 data is not yet available for the public to see, so you only have the prediction from 21 onwards, so they could not predict the high excess and whether it would be because of COVID or anything else. So, to be fair, we must also reduce some of the excess of 21 and 22 from the following years. And these are not just random reductions in the population. These are particularly the very fragile people that died in 21 and 22. So next year these fragile people who are most likely to die are no longer there. So generally the population should be a bit healthier, that remains. So this is why we reduce a certain amount from the population, which is the exact number that was the excess deaths, or we cannot talk about exact numbers, but the based on these calculations. But we multiply that with 1.5, which I think is very fair, because these are, like I said, these are the most fragile people. They are not just random people that are reduced from the population in that age group. And after this, the baseline looks like this. It goes slightly lower again. We are again concentrating on the 75 to 84 years old. It goes slightly lower, which means that we have slightly more excess, but it's not much. And remember, even without this last thing we did, there was almost the same excess. We can still check this, that there's not much of a difference there at all. And now here I have superimposed the Euromomo data for that time period from beginning of 21 to week 24 in the year 23, and we can see that there is some kind of an overall match almost to the end of 22, but then in the beginning of 23 there is no excess, there's even a negative excess. So less people dying than expected according to Euromomo in the beginning of 23, but this doesn't match with what we have found out here, taking into the account the increasement of the population in that age group. And then when we look at the 85 plus years, there is no reason to, there is no change in the addition to that age group, because that will only show up 85 years after 1945, so that will be 2030. So here we can reduce some of the previous year's excess, and this is the excess we get then in this age group. And when we compare this with the Euromomo data, there's a dramatic difference. According to Euromomo, there is no excess. There is even negative excess for the 85 plus people in 2023, but a substantial positive excess according to this study. Finally, here are the excess deaths for each year, 2020, 21, 22, for each age group. And these are per million, so that it's easier to compare with other countries, which I shall do later. So you can see that clearly more excess deaths in 2022 than 21. And the absolute number of excess deaths, based on all this information I have given here, from the beginning of 2020 to mid-23 in Finland, is about 16,000 people, out of which only 1,000 excess deaths in 2020, so 15,000 in 21, 22, first half of 23. And in the first half of 23 there have been so far about 2,500 extra deaths. Most of this, vast majority of these, are in the 75 plus aged people. And then there's still one more chart. This is the semi-annual evolution of excess mortality. So this is specifically excess mortality from 2020 to the first half of 23. And most important here in this video is to notice the green and red bars here in 23. As you can clearly see the excess for the 75 plus people, which is not at all recognized by Euromomo. According to Euromomo, since the beginning of 23 there has been no excess deaths in Finland, and to me it doesn't seem to match with the facts. And looking back, the drop of excess mortality during the first half of 21 seems to indicate that the COVID measures, such as the vaccines, were affecting, so that we had less excess mortality than the second half of 2020. However, the second half of 21 there's a dramatic increase of deaths, and even quite noticeable in the 15 to 64 years group here, the orange bar. And the final observation, and this I will be looking into more in my next video, is the huge amount of deaths, excess deaths in the second half of 22, especially since a lot of these excess deaths came in the summer month of July, August and September, which is not summer anymore, but the period from July to September generally is the least, so is the negative excess compared to the excess that you have in the autumn and in the springtime. And yet there was substantial excess in many countries in the summer of 22. So the conclusion is that there definitely seems to be lots of excess deaths continuing into 23, and it will be interesting to see how this trend will continue for the second half of this year. And these excess deaths don't appear in the Euromomo, and I will leave you to decide whether what I have found is something that actually suggests that there might be something fishy about in the way how the excess deaths in Finland and then also in some other countries are calculated, particularly this year 2023. Thank you for watching, and let's get back into these topics a bit later. See you.